I find myself at odds with how to engage with the discourse surrounding Sylvanas, both in the game and with the community as a whole. To me, it seems incredibly obvious that a lot of Blizzard's actions towards her feel like misfire after misfire, but it still somehow manages to be a popular topic of debate. It's been something of a struggle trying to explain why it feels wrong, so this is my attempt to verbalize it in a way that's mostly coherent. Full disclosure, I actually really like Sylvanas a lot as a character, and recent decisions regarding her character development have been discouraging, to say the least. I'm not saying I want her to be unquestionably good, because that's not Sylvanas. I just don't want her to be branded as permanently, irredeemably evil and crazy, because that's not her either. I think what I want for this is not to convince you that Sylvanas is either good or evil, because her character is a little bit too complicated for that, but to shed some light on why the way she's been treated is unfair, and hopefully to foster some empathy for her situation, if not for Sylvanas herself. Anyway, a few stipulations. We are mostly going to be covering content that is, or was, in-game at some point, with some dips into outside sources like books or comics, and generally avoiding what's being data mined currently, as well as the most recent book. I haven't read it, nor have I been able to get my hands on a copy of it, and data mined content is too tentative for me to trust, and there's already been more than enough discourse because of it. There are some exceptions, but we'll get to that. If you've ever played World of Warcraft, then you probably know right off the bat that it tends to be a bit of a polarizing experience, and I'm not talking about Horde versus Alliance, although that's a whole other topic of discussion we could get into. I'm talking about the characters within the game itself. If you were old enough to begin playing right at the start of Vanilla, then you probably know Thrall as War Chief of the Horde, the person who is directly responsible for the resurrection of shamanism among the orcs, and generally just friendly and all-around good guy. But if you didn't start playing until Kata or later, then you probably know Thrall as the guy who inexplicably shows up in every cutscene for no discernible reason other than to take last-minute credit for kills and allow the middle-aged men that made him to live vicariously through him. Likewise, if you played Alliance from the start, then you probably remember Anduin Wrynn as the Prince of Stormwind, a boy shrewd and wise beyond his years while struggling to live up to the name of his father, a powerful warrior in a line of warrior kings. But if you didn't start playing until Battle for Azeroth, then you probably know him as the perpetually teary-eyed pretty boy in the cinematics that, after the initial one, serves no purpose except to stand there and look pretty and teary-eyed. There are plenty of other examples, but the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of characters within the franchise, despite Blizzard's best intentions, have gone way off track and are now warped versions of their former selves. Which brings us to Sylvanas.
The Horde is nothing!
I think it's safe to say that at this point, the Dark Lady hasn't really been given a fair shake. Blizzard and fans alike are both guilty of this. In the Warcraft community, some of the more common interpretations of her character are A. Crazy frigid zombie bitch that needs to get put down like the vermin she is. B. Undead vampy sexpot, more often than not with a distressingly sadomasochistic tilt to it. C. Flawless feminist icon. Or D. Some combination of the above. And in the games themselves, she's gone from Rager General of Silvermoon to Banshee Queen of the Forsaken to War Chief of the Horde to servant of some unnamed and previously unmentioned death god, apparently. Okay. There's a lot to really unpack here, but before we really get into it, I just want to establish again that I like Sylvanas a lot as a character, and I don't think she necessarily has to be a good person in order to be a good character. She just has to be herself. However, I don't think she has been herself, not for a long time. Or at least, I have fundamental disagreements of the various incorrect interpretations of her character and with the baffling and frankly infuriating decisions made with her development. Let's go a little more into those fan interpretations. Obviously, these aren't the only ones, and I've seen some really good shit in my day, you know, because I've been playing this game for 13 fucking years. But in my experience, these tend to be the more common bad ones. So if you've played WoW for any significant length of time, you've probably run into this. Fans, usually guys in my experience, but not always, just ranting and raving in trade chat or Reddit or the official WoW forums about how Sylvanas is horrible, Sylvanas is evil, she's a villain and she's always been one, when are we gonna make her a loot pinata, etc, etc. And, you know, I can understand why they wouldn't really be that fond of Sylvanas. I like her, but she's done a lot of heinous shit in the name of the Forsaken and the Horde, and obviously that's not everybody's cup of tea. It's okay if you don't like Sylvanas, it is perfectly understandable why you wouldn't. However, the sort of people that think this, at least in my experience, tend to be the sort of people that... How do I put this delicately? They're the sort of people that think, actually, Garrosh was right to nuke Theramore. If they roleplay Horde, they're probably in a true Horde Orcs-only Korkron guild, and if they roleplay Alliance, they're probably in a Scarlet Crusade and or Calia's secret baby Menethil Restoration guild. It seems like they don't actually hate Sylvanas for what she's doing, because their favorite characters are doing mostly the same things, but for some reason there's just something about Sylvanas that makes them lose their shit. It doesn't particularly help that the narrative, for better or for worse, seems to enforce this point of view, especially in recent years. Sylvanas can't seem to get away with anything without the rest of the Horde having a civil war about it, but these other fan favorites tend to get off without so much as a hearty fuck you from the people they wronged. For example... Illidan sacrificed a lot of people, a lot of whom were his own forces, all in the selfish pursuit of a power and prestige he thought he deserved, and pretty much up until Legion has been painted as narcissistic, cowardly, and power-obsessed, and working for the Legion in exchange for fulfilling these ambitions, then running away and hiding in Outland so they wouldn't kill him for fucking up, all while setting himself up as an iron-fisted despot. But then in Legion, the narrative turns around and decides that Illidan was right, actually. And actually, he was doing all that to fight the Legion, and it was so noble how he committed all those war crimes like that. He's right, we did betray him, and he did deserve that sex dungeon in Black Temple. Kil'jaeden 100% was in it for the knowledge and power Sargeras promised when approached by him, and was totally fine with whatever Sargeras wanted him to do to get that power, because he thought it was worth it. When the faction of Eredar that eventually became the Draenei fled, he pursued them out of petty vengeance at being betrayed and corrupted an entire planet and its native denizens in order to destroy them. The reason orcs are green, went apeshit and committed atrocities against the Draenei firstly, but against many others as well, is because of this guy. The reason there was a plague of undeath, and that there's a Lich King, is because of this guy. But then the narrative turns around and goes, oh, but he felt bad about it actually, and he was just so hurt that Velen left him like that, and isn't his death just so sympathetic? Isn't it just so tragic that this immortal intergalactic space tyrant was upset that his friend didn't want to join in on his multi-planet war campaign? It's just so sad that he had to chase down the Draenei and murder them. So tragic. Meanwhile, Sylvanas did everything she could to stop the Scourge from reaching Silvermoon and died in doing so, which led her to being raised at undeath against her will and used to help destroy the very people she was trying to protect. Then, the second she was able to break away from the Scourge, she did, and immediately decided to seek vengeance for her fallen people, bringing together all the freed undead she could and making a home for them in the ruins of their former country. She even went so far as to reach out to Silvermoon again after she'd risen to bring them under the protection of the same ally that was protecting her. But you know, she's just so beautiful and proud and vain, and that means she deserved to die. It's just funny that two characters pretty consistently set in the bad guy role suddenly get a bunch more sympathy, and meanwhile Sylvanas, who's mostly been in the role of anti-hero, or anti-villain, since we have to acknowledge the turbo shit show that is Bofa now, and then for some reason the developers decide that she's just completely unsympathetic, like her death and trauma have utterly ruined her and reduced her to less than human. Of course, I'm not particularly fond of the people that like her either, because it's my nature to be contrary, but they present their own set of problems, such as liking her, but only because they want to fuck her. So it's not very often I'll run into people that dislike her for reasons beyond what essentially boil down to burn the witch because nuance is dead and we killed it. But on the other side of that is a concept I'd like to call fuck the witch, wherein these fans think Sylvanas is evil and fully acknowledge it, but they're so horny for Sylvanas being a big titty goth war criminal that they don't seem to particularly care about her actual character at all. Or, I guess a more accurate explanation for this is that they know she does a lot of morally questionable shit and just totally go along with it because being evil is cool and edgy and hot. But I feel like they're still not much different from the people that want to kill her, in that they still don't really acknowledge that she has a heart or feelings beyond anger or pride. And again, like, I can't really blame them for this. The characters that interact with Sylvanas, when not utterly repulsed by her, tend to be obsessed with her. Forsaken society and culture is literally and metaphorically built almost entirely around her, and they talk about her constantly. There's a lot of fuss over what she does for them and how she's right about everything and how can we please her. I know, more torture! But this image they formed of Sylvanas is more a cult of personality than anything else. It doesn't really show the core of her in a way that matters. The narrative doesn't often acknowledge that Sylvanas has emotions, and when it does, it's often with the stipulation that they're bad, and she's bad for having them, or she's crazy for having them. Or, despite the narrative acknowledging them, the way she's sexualized all throughout renders them hollow. It's dehumanizing the way that the focus is put on her body, and I can hardly blame the people who go along with this when the narrative and framing is telling them that this is correct, that she is just a body capable of evil. Nearly all of Sylvanas' official art has her uncomfortably sexualized in some way, and the narrative likes to take weird turns into mentioning how attractive or beautiful she is at moments where it feels really unnecessary. It took 14 actual real-world years to get Sylvanas an armor that actually covers some of her fucking body, and over half of those years are spent in a metal thong. And I find it very strange that Sylvanas, despite being separated from her body for an extended period of time, doesn't seem to suffer the same physical extent of decay as the rest of the Forsaken have, despite it literally being dead and rotting for potentially months and months on end. Like, the last time you see her in Reign of Chaos is when she's in full Banshee ghost mode, and then in Frozen Throne, suddenly she has her body again. Her inexplicably immaculate, sexy high elf body. It's actually pretty up in the air as to how she got her body back, or why she doesn't have this huge gnarly scar down her belly. In some renditions, Arthas just turns her into a banshee on the spot, but in other, later renditions, Arthas straight up pulls a pyramid head and pierces through her abdomen with his massive haunted sword, and then keeps her body in a coffin as a trophy, which really just raises further questions as to how she got it back. So it feels weird to have Sylvanas dressed in really sexually provocative clothing and then have all this really gruesome stuff forced on her. True that it showcased Arthas' arrogance and pettiness in full force as well as the extent he's fallen, but I have to ask, why this particular ire with Sylvanas to the point of keeping grisly trophies of his victory over her when there have been other, arguably more troublesome adversaries to target said ire with? And unfortunately, it's not even just Sylvanas that gets this treatment. The environment in Warcraft has been, pretty not great to women as a whole, both in the story and in the community surrounding it. It doesn't seem to be happening as much nowadays, at least I hope it doesn't, but back in the day there was a real danger of unwanted attention or even harassment for daring to speak up in the voice chat of your own raid and not being a guy. For a long time, it was a pretty common practice for DFAB people to either lie about their own gender or just avoid speaking in the raid chat altogether for fear of attracting that potential harassment. Or, if you didn't lie about it, people would just assume that you were lying about being a girl instead and harass you for that too. I've had my fair share of it, as have a lot of people I play with. Back then, it was just something you couldn't really avoid. It was expected to happen, and if it happened to you, you were often blamed for it happening, when, more often than not, it really wouldn't have mattered who the target was. Today, it just happened to be you, and there's really nothing you could have reasonably done to prevent it. Except, maybe just don't play the game, which feels about as useful as saying, just don't leave your house. And when you look at the structure of the game as a whole, not just Sylvanas, unfortunately, it's not much of a surprise that this is what the environment of WoW was like for the longest time. The dimorphism between the male and female playable models differs so wildly that they look like different species of animals, let alone different sexes of the same one. Armor on a male character will look one way and won't look like armor at all on a female character. Nearly all of the female main characters are voluptuous blue-eyed blondes that are equal parts powerful yet useless, tragic yet unsympathetic, riddled with female hysteria, and fragile enough to be killed by a fucking rock in a world with magic beyond our comprehension. When these are the unspoken rules set by the game, the people that benefit from those rules will enforce them without prompting. And when you try and go against those rules, you'll be punished or ostracized for daring to step outside the role the game has already set for you, and that's if you don't already feel alienated for being expected to perform a role that was never yours to begin with. To clarify, I'm not against characters being sexualized or touted for their physical appearance. I just think it can be done well, and it can be done badly. The reason I think it's done badly here is that it's pretty much the only option women have, or at least until recent years, and even then, that option seems limited strictly to women, with male characters being curiously desexualized despite being idealized for their strength and physicality. As far as Sylvanas goes, it feels extremely strange to have any sort of focus placed on her appearance when it doesn't appear to actually add anything to her character. All her other traits that are shown actually contribute to her character arc or the story as a whole. Like, we see her being calculating or ruthless, and we see how those traits affect the decisions she makes, which then, in turn, affects the plot. But when the story takes a minute to focus on how beautiful she is, it doesn't really add anything to the plot, except for maybe a very strange framing of how everyone that meets her immediately is struck by the urge to either kill her or fuck her, or both, depending. It honestly feels like it's unintentionally setting up a sort of meta-narrative on how WoW fans interact with Sylvanas in particular, but like I said, I sincerely doubt it's deliberate. Between these two extremely limiting and polarizing views of her, it can be difficult not to just reject both of them outright when, like I said, you're already being subjected to the same impossible standards that she's being held to. And here is where we find our third interpretation. This interpretation is very, very recent in terms of the larger scale it's on. It's definitely been around, there's no denying that, it just hasn't been as prevalent as the two from earlier, mostly because this one only started gaining traction as it's become more commonplace for women to play WoW. Even now, it feels weird saying that, because nowadays it's just such a non-issue that when something does come up, it feels more like an anomaly than a norm. This interpretation is relatively straightforward. Sylvanas is perfect, and she's done no wrong, and I love her. There's a number of things I'd like to address in this statement. Once again, I can completely understand how one would get here. When interacting with media, whether that be books or TV or games, it's hard not to identify with characters that are like you in some way. And when you don't have many options, or any options, depending, it's hard not to get protective, or even defensive, of characters you like, especially when the character in question seems to be beset on all sides by fan and creator alike. Especially when said character is getting attacked for things that other characters have done and been praised for by both the narrative and the community at large. I've seen a lot of people use this as an excuse to attack Saurfang in order to defend Sylvanas or vice versa, when really it's not the fault of either of them, because they're fictional characters and whatever fault with how they're examined or showcased falls onto the writers and developers. Saurfang's experiences and trauma are just as serious as Sylvanas's are, and it's not really fair for the narrative to really lean in his favor when there are just as many shades of gray to his story as there are hers. It feels like what Blizzard was attempting to do was to posit the question, is there such a thing as honor in war? Is there such a thing as a good war? And I think they really could have done this in a way that was interesting but still fair to both of them. Saurfang and Sylvanas have both been used as tools in war they had no business being in, but the circumstances of their respective roles aren't really examined in any sort of meaningful way. Saurfang speaks of honor and basically what could and will happen if you put it aside, but from Sylvanas' perspective, honor doesn't really amount to much when you're dead, especially when the enemies you're fighting don't really even view you as people, and probably never will. Arthas, up until that point, was this really well-to-do, honorable guy, but he still had no problem using his power and privilege to his own ends, often at the expense of his own men, and there are echoes of this in the Alliance that aren't really being given the examination that they should. I feel like there's something to be said about the rules of what counts as honor and what doesn't, and who gets to decide what these rules are, but what we get is messy, and Blizzard obviously had already decided what they were doing with Sylvanas. For her eventual betrayal to be accepted, they had to really lay it on thick how much of a bad person Sylvanas is and how much she doesn't care about anyone except herself. But ultimately, there is no action they could have taken that wasn't a decision of the developers, and really, we should be blaming them, especially since they seem to deliberately stir up tension among fans in order to profit from it.
Why would the Alliance attack the Undercity? It's a good question. It's a good question. Here's a better question. Why would the Horde burn down Teldrassil?
Something that also should be noted is the current trend of fan communities railing against certain members for opinions or preferences deemed unacceptable, and how one's personhood can be declared invalid if the mob deems it so. That's not to say that there aren't people within the community that are a danger to the people around them, because there definitely are, and they will definitely use everything in their power to paint themselves the victim in order to avoid being revealed. But there are people like that in every community, and I don't think the answer to that is to assume everyone who likes bad guy characters is a bad person, especially when the history behind villains is complicated at best, and the people most often targeted by these mobs are usually people who are in the most vulnerable position in that community. In this sort of environment, it's difficult not to feel like you constantly have to justify yourself for liking certain characters or aspects of a story, when it's more often appealing to your emotions than it is your logic. So when it comes to someone like Sylvanas, who is, shall we say, morally ambiguous, and constantly beset by people making bad faith arguments that really just boil down to basic misogyny, it can be difficult not to go, Sylvanas is good actually, to justify why you like a character that's not necessarily a good person when you really shouldn't have to feel like you have to justify it at all. This is a very easy pitfall to encounter, especially when you already have to constantly justify your own existence and you know in your heart that these chucklefucks can and will deny your humanity at any time they want, whether or not you've actually done anything bad. Sylvanas' story is tragic and sympathetic, and I'm not denying that. But to say that she's never done anything bad, or at least morally questionable, is just wrong, and implies an extremely warped understanding of her character. You don't have to argue that Sylvanas is a good person in order to like her character, but you shouldn't have to completely deny her of said character either. She can be both reprehensible and sympathetic, and it doesn't break her. She is both, and that's the point. And that brings us to my next point. So the term gray morality has been thrown around a lot, especially in recent years as media has been trending towards darker and grittier content, but the meaning of the term, much like the content it applies to, isn't exactly cut and dry. It's pretty safe to say that it's been misused a lot, particularly by creators looking to make more novel, interesting content, but have failed to realize that, in order for it to be gray morality, there needs to be a few key qualities. To my understanding, and believe me, trying to research this was interesting, gray morality is the concept that no sentient being is completely good or completely evil, and that their emotions, beliefs, and motivations aren't straightforward. They're complicated, they twist and turn. When done well, gray morality reflects this, and in this reflection we find empathy in the character's imperfections because we are imperfect beings. So I would argue that the qualities of gray morality that make it what it is are first and foremost empathy, which we then use to understand its other qualities, drive and circumstance. Without that empathy, we cannot begin to make sense of what emotions or motivations drive these characters, or what circumstances have pushed these characters to where they are now in their development. While a character's desires may make what drives them readily apparent, and may be what attracts us to them to begin with, you cannot argue that a character is morally gray unless the understanding of why they're doing this, the empathy, is present. While Sylvanas may have been morally gray at first, I would hesitate to call her that now, especially in light of recent developments. Like I said, it's no secret that Warcraft has changed a lot over the years, and has been in the public eye for a long time. The first Warcraft game came out in 1994, and the MMO is over 15 years old now. Changes to the story and its characters are inevitable, especially when it's spread over multiple radically different games. In Warcraft, Orcs and Humans, an RTS game, the Horde faction is irredeemably, brainlessly evil, but by the time they'd started developing the point-and-click puzzle-solving Warcraft adventures not 2 years later, they'd already started writing them as actual people instead of just stupid knockoff Warhammer minions, and even more so when the story was adapted into the Lord of the Clans novel by Christie Golden in 2001. Obviously, the platform in which the story is presented isn't entirely the reason for all the changes in it, but it is undeniably the cause of fundamental changes in which the story is received. You'll generally find that it is much, much easier to empathize with a character in first-person perspective, that is, the character you're playing as or seeing from the point of view from, than it is in third-person perspective, wherein you're the outsider looking in, and the motivations of other characters aren't so readily apparent. I think part of the issue why there's these multiple radically different interpretations is that it's a lot harder to figure out Sylvanas' motivations in the MMO than it is in the RTS. In Warcraft 3, you're right there alongside her, or playing as her, and you understand each action she takes as you command her to take them. Minus the in-game cutscenes, you're pretty much in control of Sylvanas' actions the very minute Arthas kills her pretty early into the Undead campaign. In World of Warcraft, you barely even interact with her directly until, Wrath of the Lich King if I'm being generous, or when she's made War Chief in Legion if I'm not. There's a smattering of quests in Vanilla and BC where you interact with her directly, but the total amount of both of them combined is 5. 5 quests over the span of 4 years. Yes, Lamented the Highborn is really cool and a great addition to the game, but it is one questline, and one that isn't readily available unless you're willing to either roll a Blood Elf or hoof it to a Blood Elf questing zone. It is extremely difficult to empathize with a character you barely interact with, and that you can barely see the machinations of unless you put everything even remotely related to them under a magnifying glass, and it just gets more difficult when the narrative that the writers are trying to achieve is different from the one they're actually writing. Often, when you're writing towards a very specific ending, the path of how you get there isn't quite what you planned it to be, and it's very easy to go off the path and land somewhere else, then realize, oh shit, this isn't what you were trying to write, and then rush towards a predetermined ending that no longer fits the story you've written. Blizzard, I feel, has a habit of not missing the forest for the trees, but missing the trees for the forest? Let's play with that a little bit. So Blizzard has this big picture set up, the forest if you will, of what they want to do with the story and characters, as well as certain major events, and what makes up that forest are the trees, the small but important details that come together to form the whole. So questlines, environments, NPCs, these are your trees. And when you're developing a story, it's pretty common that it'll start growing in a direction that you probably didn't intend, especially if there are multiple writers, artists, and developers all working on this thing together. That just makes it all the more likely that it's going to take off in multiple different directions. Everyone has different ideas and interpretations, and they're going to plant them in the larger story as they see fit. But this isn't a bad thing necessarily. To be honest, this is a big part of why I really like WoW. There's this huge spectrum of personality and different types of storytelling going on in the game thanks to all these different writers and artists. And it can be really illuminating to grow your story in these different directions and see where they lead you, or what themes or characters are important in this new direction. However, the key to making this a good thing is how willing you are to change and adapt to fit this. And I think somewhere along the lines, Blizzard's initial overall big picture of Sylvanas and the Forsaken want revenge on Arthas and every living thing kind of got lost along the trees. And that's fine, or it would have been fine, if not for a few things. Another thing that has radically changed over the years is the scaling of story events. It's natural that, over the course of a story, the stakes will get higher and higher until they finally reach their resolution. But in an MMO, especially one as long-running as WoW, it's really difficult to reach that resolution, especially if the developers want to keep the game running. You can never tie off every single loose end if you wanted to keep going, and you're gonna have to introduce more and more new plot threads to follow if you do end up tying a few off. With each addition to the story, there are so many new plot threads introduced that, more often than not, some plot threads are deemed as just not worth pursuing and are kind of just dropped without any sort of resolution, regardless of how much work was put into them or how well received it was by fans. Not that I'm saying fans should be listened to or should get what they want, because that's how we got these. The plot threads that Blizzard do decide to keep are often baffling and don't really appear to make any logical sense or have any appeal beyond the sheer aesthetic. In that same vein, something they may decide is good now, they can and have outright tossed later. Again, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Blizzard developers on multiple occasions have talked about how a lot of their story choices are inspired or based on more of the emotional appeal than the logical one, like if it feels right or how cool it is. This is often referred to as the rule of cool, wherein a logical choice to a story may be put aside in favor of an emotionally or aesthetically appealing one. It may not make sense, but fuck me if it's not really fucking cool. And this can be done really well. Their other games, Hearthstone and Heroes of the Storm, basically run almost entirely on this, and are really successful because of it. But it only works because there isn't really a structured storyline to either game, nor do they need one. Despite itself, WoW is very structured and needs some kind of logical framework for the emotional appeal to fall back on. If the emotional appeal goes too far with its ridiculousness or doesn't land with its audience, then it can have extremely negative results. I think this is kind of what happened with Warlords of Draenor, actually. The entire expansion was running on nostalgia and emotional appeal, but while there were certain aspects that landed really well, for the most part it went too far and ended up tripping over itself, and there wasn't really any sort of logical framework it could use to hold itself up. There is no reason, sensibly or aesthetically, for Sylvanas to have ordered the burning of Teldrassil. There is no reason for the developers to have provoked the fans into faction conflict at BlizzCon before revealing that the Horde were the aggressors the whole time and always have been. There is no reason for Sylvanas to rue the avoidable loss of her forces in taking Darkshore and go through the pains of evacuating Undercity, only for her to turn around and show no care for them whatsoever at the Battle of Lordaeron. There is no reason whatsoever for her to have burned that fucking tree down when the battle was already won and she had the Alliance right where she wanted them, only to suddenly be pulled into a game of chicken with a half-dead elf and order it done out of sheer spite. And the reason we're given later is so nonsensical that it contradicts literally everything she's done up until this point. And this is where we find the game now, where many of the story choices are so disconnected emotionally from the players that a lot of the players find themselves frustrated and alienated from a story that no longer holds appeal or sense. Not only that, but the stakes of the story have been heightened so much based just on what's cool that we've left the fucking atmosphere. We are, literally and figuratively, in outer space. There is no longer any gravity to the situation, as the dangers therein have been rendered meaningless. How many times has there been an apocalyptic level scenario that's forced Alliance and Horde to put aside their differences and defeat it together? How many times have we defeated this evil, only to immediately be back at each other's throats? For what reason do the Alliance and Horde have to fight anymore when it's been demonstrated time and time again that there are bigger and worse enemies out there? How many times must we learn this lesson? How many times must history repeat itself? Oh, and don't give me that, oh, but it's World of Warcraft bullshit. You cannot have conflict if it has no meaning, and your conflict can't have meaning if it doesn't fucking make sense. You cannot hand-wave away every single thing you find inconvenient in the story, because eventually you will have nothing left. The knowledge that Blizzard openly and frequently goes back on their own lore isn't exactly news. WoW fans have been in this rodeo a long time, and Overwatch fans are just starting to get a taste of it. You know what? Maybe I'm not being fair to Blizzard. Warcraft is a really big franchise, and I'd imagine it's hard to keep track of. But you know, I feel like maybe it'd be easier to keep a handle on their own lore if they maybe, didn't fire their criminally underpaid employees en masse after working them half to death. Maybe that's just me. Wonder where all that loot box money went. I feel that I should start by saying again, like all other methods of crafting a story, retconning isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be useful and corrective in some areas, especially for gameplay. In the original lore, Night Elf men couldn't be priests, and women couldn't be druids. But for gameplay, there isn't really much sense in this, so it was dropped in favor of accessibility and creativity on behalf of the players. I mean, hell, in the original Warcraft RTS, orcs were mindless killing machines, and if that wasn't dropped, we wouldn't have really cool orc characters now, like Thrall or Rexxar, or even Garrosh. But to say that retconning has helped the game as much as it's hindered it just feels fundamentally wrong. Many of the characters, not even just Sylvanas, directly contradict themselves in everything they do over the course of their lifetime within the game. Character development is tossed aside or rendered meaningless as the developers bend and break them to suit the needs of the story, rather than let them grow on their own or create new characters to fill the role. Anduin goes from strong-willed cane-using prince to wishy-washy, armor-plated king, Jaina from beleaguered peacekeeper to hateful warmonger, Thrall from champion gladiator, shaman, and warchief of the Horde to depressed, flaky hermit, Garrosh from melancholic but protective leader of the Mag'har to manic tyrant. The list goes on and on. Sylvanas' character development is in a constant state of cloak-and-dagger I-told-you-sos. She swings wildly between caring for the Forsaken and being disgusted by them, loving the Horde and thinking nothing of them but a tool to be used, being cunning and calculating one minute and impulsive and petty the next, and going far above and beyond the call of duty to defend her friends and loved ones before revealing that it was all part of her master plan and she's just been a selfish, power-hungry bitch the whole time and you didn't even suspect a thing. Now don't get me wrong, I do think that there should be some level of complication, or even hypocrisy, to Sylvanas and her emotions. She and the Forsaken, having been, well, forsaken, find it extremely difficult to trust anyone anymore, and are still convinced of everyone's secret treachery towards them, even while they receive help from them. It is natural that this would happen at first, and I think in general, this is just an aspect of Sylvanas' personality at this point. When one experiences trauma of this nature, it is an extremely big hurdle to overcome, and can take a very long time to actually do so. Oftentimes, trauma of this nature can and will change you as your mind adapts to defend itself, taking on new and unrecognizable shapes just to survive. Your own emotions can be buried or hidden from you if that's what's forced to change. That's certainly the case for Sylvanas. However, it is wrong for the narrative to imply that she's completely heartless and never cared about the Horde or the Forsaken or the Blood Elves and never did, especially when one of her prime motivations is heart. The things she's doing aren't advisable, or even acceptable really, but despite what she says, Sylvanas is still very much capable of empathy and love. She wouldn't try so hard to help the Blood Elves if she didn't still care about them, and wouldn't be so fixated on her revenge if she wasn't so hurt by what happened to her and everyone she cares about. I mean, it feels obvious. If she were so incapable of feeling, if the Forsaken were so incapable of feeling, then they wouldn't care so much about getting revenge on the people that wronged them. If she and the Forsaken were so incapable of feeling, then they wouldn't be getting so cozy with the Horde and wouldn't be inviting their estranged kin to join in for the safety and survival that they know that the Horde can provide. If Sylvanas was as hollow and emotionless as she says she is, then she wouldn't give a single fuck about that best friends forever necklace from her sister, she wouldn't put on a concert mourning the Sidori, and she wouldn't be so fucking hurt about Thrall abandoning the Horde. I get that this one is a bit of a reach, but I'd like to think that Heroes of the Storm, in all its pageantry, showcases Blizzard's most iconic characters in their truest selves, for the most part. These are the characters at their best and brightest, and more importantly, their most recognizable. The depiction of Sylvanas in Heroes of the Storm is Sylvanas at her best and most honest representation. It would follow, then, that Sylvanas' interactions with other characters in HOTS are at their most accurate, and I cannot imagine any other reason for Sylvanas to say this when she gets a kill on an enemy thrall.
That was for giving the Horde to Garrosh.
It reasonably stands that Blizzard wouldn't put this in unless they felt totally confident that this is exactly what Sylvanas would do when put in this situation, but I have to question, why would they do this, and this, and this, and this, only to turn around and have her do this? Why put so much effort into showing that, no matter how she hides it, no matter how twisted it is, Sylvanas does have a heart, only to turn around and say, actually, Sylvanas is selfish and never gave a shit about anyone or anything? Again, I'm not saying Sylvanas has to be a good person. We are well beyond that now, and whether or not a character is good aligned has nothing to do with how likable or sympathetic they are. I just have to ask, why is the tragedy of Sylvanas Windrunner painted as unsympathetic by the narrative when incel dipshits like Illidan get portrayed as edgy, badass anti-heroes? Let's talk about Edge of Night. Personally, to me, Cataclysm is about when things really started to go sideways as far as lore goes. While there was massive improvement as far as quality of life and quality of gameplay go, this is also when more of the most extreme makeovers happened in terms of character development. And in my opinion, the Cataclysm storyline is about the worst fucking thing to happen to Warcraft bar none, the ramifications of which we are still dealing with to this day, and yes, I'm including Warlords of Draenor when I say this, do not fucking at me. Say what you will about Dad Lords, but at least its bullshit stopped the second the expansion was over, or so we thought. And meanwhile, we are still dealing with the aftermath of major decisions made in Cataclysm. And I'm bringing this up specifically because while Wrath was a wild ride for Sylvanas and the Forsaken, it was still mostly coherent. At this point in time, the Forsaken had this nice dual narrative of being mostly integrated into the Horde while still pursuing their own goals of revenge. These 2 points come to a head at the Battle of the Wrathgate, wherein a splinter group of apothecaries headed by Grand Apothecary Putris turn against everyone there, dumping the newly completed blight on everyone and everything, including their fellow Horde members. Sylvanas, cast out from her own city, must once again turn to the Horde for help, and once again she receives it. The player, Thrall and Sylvanas delve the depths of the Undercity, clearing out traitors along the way, and reclaim it for Sylvanas and the Forsaken. This questline was removed from the game when Cataclysm was released. Maybe I'm just sour on account of this being one of, if not my very favorite questline, but it just seems awfully fucking suspicious that they removed this part of the questline from the game, but not the part where Putris and his ilk turn on you, just in time for them to ramp up how crazy and evil Sylvanas and the Forsaken are. Like in Edge of Night, where Sylvanas reveals that, well, actually, she's just been using the Forsaken the whole time, and she's disgusted by them. You know, the people for whom she got on her knees and begged for help, the city she mourned for, absolutely disgusted by them. And, well, actually, she's never cared about the cost of life when it comes to war, not even when she was still alive. You know, because a cunning tactician like Sylvanas would willingly throw away the lives of her rangers to an enemy that absolutely can and will raise the dead just to stall them for time. And, well, actually, Sylvanas didn't know that there always needed to be a Lich King, despite already having learned this in the Halls of Reflection. But I think the worst blow, the very worst blow this short story dealt to Sylvanas' character was that she died and was brought into undeath because she was vain. That because of this vanity, she would be cursed to suffer the same fate as Arthas once she had died her true death. Let me repeat that to be explicitly clear. Sylvanas Windrunner, who was killed by Arthas Menethil, is apparently cursed to suffer the same punishment as her fucking murderer, a man who razed half a continent to the ground, including his own country, and caused death and destruction everywhere he went, with no thought other than to please his new sugar daddy. She had not yet seen her 20th autumn, yet already young Sylvanas was the most promising hunter in her family. She pulled on her thigh-high leather boots, carefully measuring the laces and decoratively tying them. She adjusted the leaf-patterned embroidery, then bounced herself off the bed to admire her reflection in the mirror. Her waist-length blonde hair flowed like water, absolutely translucent in the light of the sun. She beamed at the mirror, teasing her hair until it dashed around her long, slender ears in just the perfect way. It wasn't good enough to be the best hunter in her family. She needed to take everyone's breath away as she ventured out. She was so very vain. 9 warrior women drifted in a circle around her, and their beauty outshone even hers. The Valkyr appeared as they had in life. Some had raven dark hair that fell around tanned faces and jewel-like blue eyes. Others had blonde manes, the pale, brilliant color of sun shining on snow. Their faces were soft, but their jaws hard. Their arms were smooth and muscled, their thighs wide and strong. Each held a different weapon, a spear, a halberd, a great 2-handed claymore that stretched from chin to ground in a shimmering swath of polished steel. Each was the greatest warrior of her generation. They were all just like me, Sylvanas saw. Vain, victorious, and proud. Weird, not only that we're going into great detail to describe the attractiveness of a teenage girl like it's something to condemn her with, but that of all the traits Sylvanas could have been condemned for in the first place, not her coldness, not her ruthlessness, not her cruelty, Blizzard went with vanity. It would be one thing if they went with pride. There's been comparisons between her and Arthas before, by both Blizzard and the community as a whole, and while I have opinions about this we'll be getting into a little later, the least they could have done is make the easiest, lowest hanging fruit comparison by making it about pride and entitlement born of Sylvanas' natural ability, plus the love of her people driving her to do the unthinkable, instead of fucking vanity. This is easily the biggest insult Blizzard could have lobbed at Sylvanas. This is far from the first time anything like this has happened. The idea that vanity is specifically feminine has been around for centuries, and has been in all forms of art and media since the idea was initially conceived. It even has its own page on TV tropes. By making vanity the motivation behind Sylvanas' actions, rather than literally anything else, Blizzard has ripped the rug out from under any sort of meaningful development she could have had. Making it vanity rather than pride is a very specific sort of branding, and leaves very little room for much else beyond it. Pride by itself isn't inherently negative. A prideful person can still be capable of thought and action beyond said pride. A prideful person is still capable of love and empathy, and this can often be a factor of motivation alongside that pride. A vain person is vain because they only think of themselves. A vain person, by the unspoken rules set down by the game, is incapable of anything else. When I say unspoken rules, I mean the series of patterns in story and character archetypes that commonly pop up in Blizzard's storylines. Sure, there's the obvious ones, like the weird fixation with evil undead, blue-skinned femme fatales, often with a box-head bow trying to save them, but there's some others with troubling implications that aren't so readily obvious. Let's look at Sylvanas' peers and fellow Warbringers, Azshara and Jaina. So Azshara is definitely what I'd call an example of a good use of a character's main trait being vanity. She's pretty strongly characterized with what little we see of her, and despite hitting a lot of the stereotypical marks of a vain, hyper-feminine villain, her authority is never undermined, and whenever she's underestimated, typically on account of being seemingly vapid in addition to vain, whoever underestimates her usually ends up paying for it. Azshara is powerful, and knows she is, and this vanity is what drove her to both seek power from the Legion, and then, when that fell through, what drove her to attempt to save her empire, first by herself, then by mouthing off to an eldritch horror that she ended up having a hand in finishing off anyway. Vanity as the drive works here, because Azshara has been set up from the start as such, and this has continued as her through-line motivation all throughout. Azshara wants to save her people, not because she loves them, but because they are hers. They belong to her, just like her empire belongs to her, and God help the poor idiot that even attempts to get in the way of their worship of her. Azshara's vanity is so powerful that she was able to manipulate a god into doing what she wished, and even after her monstrous transformation, she still considers herself the very peak of power and beauty. And she's right, and I love that for her. However, it should be noted that Azshara stands out because her characterization was strong from the start, even prior to her transformation. Making vanity Sylvanas' emotional core really doesn't work because that's not how she was set up. From the very start, Sylvanas' key motivations have been vengeance for herself, for the Fallen, and for Silvermoon, and vanity has an intrinsic clash with that. Pride works, and dictates exactly why she would want to subject Arthas to a slow, torturous death, while still having enough room to care for the Blood Elves and the Forsaken, and later on, the Horde. Pride enables her to think that she knows best, and she's right, and that you should just trust her without her having to tell you everything because she knows what's best for you. Pride is still capable of love, even if that which loves you is incredibly, horrifyingly misguided and wrong. Jaina and Sylvanas are similar in a lot of ways. They've even acted as faction foils to each other at times, especially during Wrath. But probably the biggest similarity between them is how they've been treated by both Blizzard and the community. It feels obvious to say that Jaina's character arc has gone off the rails, because it is, and it has. Jaina's entire personality and outlook radically changed overnight with one single controversial story event, and has since been broadly treated with scorn or pity, at least until Daughter of the Sea dropped. What I find interesting about this is that, from when the Theramore's Fall scenario was put in-game to when her Warbringers video was uploaded to YouTube, she was pretty widely regarded as being an unjustified, unhinged extremist. All discourse is the same. So for 6 actual real-world years, fans said that she was crazy and basically rejected this overnight character revamp to the point where there was a long-standing fan theory that she'd been replaced by a Dreadlord, and Blizzard said that she was crazy, and while they didn't actually replace her with a Dreadlord, they might as well have, for how wildly different she was from before. To be fair, there is some truth to this. Trauma can radically change a person, and they don't often resemble how they were before afterwards. But there's something genuinely insidious about how keen the writers seem to be on punishing her for experiencing a trauma that they wrote her to have to begin with, especially when they have other characters they had be hateful warmongers turn around and suddenly go, hey, maybe we shouldn't commit these hideously inhumane war crimes. To her, specifically. After she'd spent years and years trying to convince them of that before all this. Yes, it's true that trauma changes you, but there is no inherently deeper meaning to having everyone she's known and loved abandon or condemn her for things largely out of her control, or even things they would do themselves and have done themselves. It's just mean, especially when you have countless other male counterparts whose emotional through-line runs on sympathy generated from their dramatic man pain. I suspect that, if not for a lot of campaigning by her fans, she wouldn't have even gotten the redemption that she did. There's also something to be said about how Jaina's redemption arc involved her actually being held accountable for her actions and being punished for them, unlike the others I've mentioned before who basically don't have to do anything to be redeemed. The one crime that she was being punished for wasn't even one that she had done herself. Super Hell Jail feels like a really disproportionate punishment for having your own father imprison you and your forces and then taking over the city you built from the ground up just because he didn't approve of the friends you were making. Jaina, during her stint as a scorned woman committing woman crimes, has done a lot of bad things, but this is not one of them. That this is what she was chosen to be held accountable and punished for really begs the question of what constitutes a character's potential for redemption, especially if all these other characters meet these unspoken standards, despite having done far more and far worse. Speaking of, it is now time to talk about Arthas. I've already touched on it a little bit, but we need to dig into this a little more on account of the, unfortunate, more recent trend of comparing Sylvanas to Arthas, because reasons. Not that this comparison hasn't been around for a while. World of Warcraft is 15 years old, and as I've said, all discourse is the same, but I take particular issue with this one. Beyond the extremely basic comparison of Arthas is prideful and evil, and so is Sylvanas, so that means they're the same, it is utterly baffling to me that any sort of meaningful connection can be made beyond that, let alone to the point of saying Sylvanas is the next Arthas, as the kids say nowadays. From the very start, Sylvanas has been set up as being distinctly different from Arthas, and it's frustrating that this comparison would be made for a number of reasons. It should also be noted that, for all these similarities people say there are, the very nature of what they do and why they do it are so radically different from each other that it hardly feels like a strong basis of comparison. There's no denying that they are similar in a lot of ways, but I feel that comparing them really isn't as useful as contrasting them is. In Warcraft 3, Sylvanas' role in the story is to be something of a reflection of Arthas, or at least a reflection of how he used to be. She's a hero of her people. She's skilled, confident, persistent, and willing to do whatever it takes to protect them. We see her growing frustrated and desperate as Arthas continues his slaughter of Quel'Thalas, but unlike Arthas, who succumbed to his pride and anger when Lordaeron began to fall, Sylvanas' will remain strong until the very end. She even has the audacity to demand that he give her a clean death, despite everything. This, right here, tells us that Sylvanas is different, that unlike Arthas, she had the strength to keep going in the face of doubt and horror. Maybe this is what drove him to such cruelty when he decided to kill and enslave her in Undeath. He couldn't bear to see himself in someone who didn't succumb to the madness and corruption. Or maybe he's just a bratty, entitled little man-baby, and she gave him a hard time, and that's illegal. But the point remains. Sylvanas had her undeath forced upon her, and Arthas, despite having chance after chance of walking away or making it right, chose this fate. It could be argued that he was manipulated into it, but it wasn't Ner'zhul who told him to burn down Stratholme, now was it? It wasn't Ner'zhul who told him to turn on his own men, and it wasn't Ner'zhul who told him to take up Frostmourne. He might have guided him a fair amount down this path, but he did not force him to do this. Arthas, despite all reason, despite all objection, went forward with the wholesale slaughter and razing of Stratholme. And this really should have been the point of no return for Arthas, but even after that, he had so many opportunities to stop what he was doing and come home. But Arthas chose pride and revenge every single time, and to deny that is to deny the accountability and complicity in his own actions. Arthas, of his own will, chose to cut down his people while they still lived, chose to kill the very men he hired, and chose to betray his own soldiers by destroying their only way back home. And what does Sylvanas choose when she's actually given the choice? Survival. She had no choice when she was killed, nor when undeath was forced upon her, but staring down the barrel of both, Sylvanas did everything she could to survive. She did not choose to go down a path to power and cruelty. She was dragged down the path by Arthas himself, kicking and screaming the whole way. and this paints a significantly different picture of her undeath than it does Arthas's. Prideful and vengeful though she may be, when given the choice, survival trumps all, and this is where the gray morality comes in. Arthas's path is a pretty clear descent into darkness, but Sylvanas's is murkier. She's vicious and ruthless, but she has nothing and no one left to turn to. What other choice does she have, besides survival? From the very moment she was raised, Sylvanas thinks she's a monster, and so does everyone else. There is no point in her campaign in which anybody treated her as anything besides the scum of the earth. All of the living creatures she encounters attack her on sight, and even the one living person she gets to work with still treats her like she's filth and is constantly framed as being a huge bigot the entire time he's around, even in other storylines outside of Sylvanas's. There was literally no chance that anyone was going to acknowledge her as a sentient being and not a monster, so that's what she became in order to survive. And survival, even with its unsavory means, is a far more sympathetic motivation than pride could ever be. Even the one time that pride and vengeance trumped survival, she still realized her stupid mistake eventually and chose survival again the very second she could. But despite all of this, in the narrative, there is this lingering sense of Sylvanas being punished for being how she is, and deserving it, however out of her control it may be. Despite all this, Arthas' story is painted as being far more tragic, to the point of being romanticized by both Blizzard and the community. Over and over again, the question is raised, could Arthas have been saved? And yet, despite all the hardship she's been through, the question is never even an option for Sylvanas. Arthas revels in his undeath, he's empowered by it, and his reward is to die in the arms of his father, comforted by him. Yes, he's punished afterwards, but even this is painted as a tragedy and a pity, even by Sylvanas, who says with her mouth that she pities him. And Sylvanas, for all her sacrifice, for all her striving, for all the violence rendered onto her and her faction, is still demonized by the text and everyone in it. And I think the real crux of this is that, within the text, Arthas has people advocating for him, and Sylvanas doesn't. It's probably not a big surprise at this point that I just have a real bee in my bonnet when it comes to Arthas, just as a person and general concept, but to be honest, I probably wouldn't have as big a list of grievances against him if it weren't for how many and how often people advocate for him. There are a lot of people in the community that advocate for him, and it's genuinely infuriating for me to watch this happen, probably in no small part thanks to the sort of defensive apologism fandom communities as a whole have been fostering, but also because it's largely encouraged by the text and other characters within the text. Jaina advocates for Arthas whenever she mourns who he once was, and literally chases after him to try and talk to him, as if this has all been just a huge misunderstanding. King Taranis advocates for Arthas when he comforts him at the moment of his defeat. Calia advocates for him when she recalls the boy her brother once had been, and recounts her complicated relationship with his memory. It is astronomically easier to empathize with a character in the text when other characters in the text are already doing it. Empathy with the player is greatly encouraged when other characters are already doing the emotional work for the player. And Arthas is far from the only one who gets this treatment. There's literally an entire extended questline in-game wherein Zera, badly, advocates for Illidan, trying to paint him and every selfish thing he's done as an act for the greater good. When you give Tyrande his letter, she tells him to fuck off, as well she should, but Malfurion has a tender moment, thinking about his strained relationship with his brother and if he could have done anything different. Velen greets Kil'jaeden like he's one of his oldest friends, and essentially forgives him while he's on his deathbed. Garrosh Hellscream, probably one of the worst tyrants in recent memory, is given an extremely emotionally wrought scene with Thrall, accusing him of abandoning him, and Thrall can't even dispute this. Anduin, when called up to the stand during Garrosh's trial, tells the court that yes, he does think Garrosh can change. And Anachronos, a bronze drake, tells the player what an awful shame it is that Garrosh turned out like this in this timeline, because in every other, he's one of the greatest war chiefs the Horde has ever known. It should be noted that, up until Cataclysm, the worst thing to ever happen to WoW, Jaina was painted as something as a moral backbone for the Alliance, and Anduin is still filling that role. And what do these two think about Sylvanas? Anduin thinks she's an irredeemable monster that's gone too far and has to be destroyed, and Jaina, while pitying her at first, now thinks the same, and that's real fucking rich coming from her. So according to these two morally upstanding individuals, Sylvanas deserves no sympathy. According to Anduin, beautiful sad boy and king by divine right, Garrosh deserves sympathy, but Sylvanas doesn't. Therefore, Sylvanas is worse than Garrosh Hellscream, known bigot and fascist, who openly targeted non-orc members of the Horde and effectively made them second-class citizens, took actions to enforce this, somehow thought he was strong enough to resist the will of an old god, and whose astounding incompetence and single-minded belligerence nearly led the Horde and Azeroth and alternate Draenor to ruin. We're supposed to think that Sylvanas is worse than this guy. Again, I don't think any of these characters' arcs have been dealt with fairly, but the shit they put Sylvanas through is just obnoxious. Don't get me wrong, she has done some whack-ass shit, but I really doubt she's worse than Johnny Planet Ruiner over there. The point I'm trying to make is that Sylvanas has been pretty soundly rejected and abandoned by everyone she's ever known, and the narrative around it just confirms that they were right to abandon her, and encourages the player to agree with that notion. Both of Sylvanas' sisters, when their relationship was rekindled, almost immediately split from her just as soon as they reunited with her, and they blame Sylvanas for it as if they didn't both leave her and the High Elves long before she had died for their own reasons. Illyria wasn't able to come back for a long time, but what was stopping Verisa? Yes, her reunion with Sylvanas went a little rocky, but what was stopping her from getting in contact with her sister before that? Illyria had been back from her adventures in space-time for a hot minute before deciding to meet back up with her sisters. What was Verisa doing, besides, neglecting her kids? Not that Illyria's any better. Why does it only take one meeting for Illyria to decide that Sylvanas is a monster and can't be saved, which is real fucking funny coming from her? And why does Verisa lie about what happened between them? On that note, why does Lorthamar just assume that Sylvanas doesn't give a shit about the Blood Elves anymore when Sylvanas put a whole hell of a lot on the line to help them? Why is it that all these other characters and their choices can be complicated or emotionally charged, even when they don't really deserve it, but Sylvanas' choices are never presented as anything but cruel, hysterical evil? What is so different about Sylvanas that the line is drawn with her? Alright, it's been long enough. We gotta talk about Calia Menethil. Okay. Calia is different from the characters I've mentioned before. Unlike the others who are peers or comparative foils, Calia is a possible replacement. While there is confirmation in a recent Q&A that no, Calia is not going to be the new Forsaken faction leader, Lillian Voss is, it's still extremely suspicious that she appears to have a significant role to play in the upcoming Shadowlands expansion. Also, Blizzard has a history of saying shit like, Vol'jin isn't going to be the next war chief, or Tandred isn't canon, or the Horde didn't start the war this time, and then they turn around and do the exact things they said they weren't gonna do, so... She's simultaneously the least like and the most like Sylvanas out of everyone here because she and Sylvanas have experienced the same event but have radically different traumas from them. It's in those differences that we find the line that separates Sylvanas from the sympathy that the narrative thinks she is so undeserving of. Calia, like Sylvanas, dealt with the Scourge firsthand when Arthas first ascended, but unlike Sylvanas, who stayed and fought and died, Calia managed to escape, was separated from her husband and child, pretty sure they're dead but the wiki seems to think otherwise, and eventually found safety in the hands of Alonzus Fowl, who she then presumably trained under to become a priest. Calia survived, unbeknownst to everyone, until she was killed by Sylvanas and raised by Fowl and Anduin as a light-infused undead. I have reservations about that concept, but let's put that aside for right now and focus on the concept of good victim, bad victim. TV Tropes describes good victim, bad victim as a morality trope about the arbitrary distinctions writers make between certain sorts of victims. If a character in fiction has a problem or ailment or social situation, and the creators intend him to be sympathetic, the character will have acquired the problem in the most socially acceptable way. If the character isn't sympathetic, then he will have contracted the illness through his own damn fault. There's a hell of a lot more to it than that, especially the ways that concept takes shape in the real world and affects real people, but seeing as we're restricting this to just analyzing media, then it's appropriate to cite a source focused on media. Obviously, Calia is the good victim here, and Sylvanas is the bad one because of the attitude the narrative takes towards each of them, but I want to address an element of this that wasn't really covered at all that well in this definition. The idea that suffering and how you respond to it makes you a better person. It's a pretty common thought that having a hard life makes you strong, and that certain people are kind only because of how much suffering they've experienced at the hands of others. And having experienced this myself for the better part of half my life, I can confirm right here, right now, that suffering at the hands of others doesn't make you kinder, it just makes you hurt. So the problem or illness in question is obviously undeath. To clarify, I have no qualms with Calia and her survival. I don't think she should have stayed back and died, and I was okay with how her character was handled in Legion. Calia has made a life for herself in her time since Lordaeron's fall, and doesn't define herself by what she used to be. I think it's really cool that this is the take the writers had for Calia. It's very, very rare that a female character in any media, but especially Warcraft, is even allowed to live past her trauma, let alone that it's not the focal point of her very existence. Then, before the storm happened. Dear one, I am so sorry the dream has troubled you once more. Calia nodded, sinking down in front of Sarah and twisting her fingers awkwardly. I keep thinking that they will stop at some point. They will, the gentle being assured her, once you are ready for them to stop. So you've said, but why can't I be ready now? She laughed a little, hearing the petulance in her own voice. There are things you must do before that peace will be granted to you. Things that you must understand, that you must integrate into yourself. People who need your help. What one needs in order to heal will always come one's way, but sometimes it is hard to recognize it. Sometimes the most beautiful and important gifts come wrapped in pain and blood. That's not making me feel better, Calia said. It might when you realize that all that has happened to you hides a gift within it. It's no secret that Blizzard has a history of not really handling the concept of mental illness that well, what with their string of bad guys that were made evil by trauma, or are just so crazy that they can't help themselves. So, following that tradition of handling it clumsily, it is revealed that Calia has been having night terrors about her husband and daughter, and what potentially gruesome fate they may have met. And that's fine. Honestly, that's to be expected. Like I said before, trauma can change you and leave its marks on you in ways that you don't really expect, and one of the big symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder is having nightmares of the traumatic event in question. In therapy, you learn how to deal with the after effects of this trauma and skills to help you move on with your life and take care of yourself. In particular, there's a couple ways to help you deal with your nightmares, including keeping a journal of your bad dreams and keeping good sleep hygiene, but the important thing to understand is that a lot of it is out of your control and there really isn't much you can do to stop them without getting the proper help. Again, apart from deliberately triggering yourself, you can't really control when they come. Nightmares, with very little exception, are not your fault. They just happen because they're a symptom of your being sick, like when the body has a fever. It's your brain attempting to work through the emotional fallout of said trauma, like your immune system destroying a virus by burning it out. It's trying to deal with it, but right now it's just causing you unnecessary anguish. The only way you can get better is by getting the right medicine. Anyway, Calia having nightmares about her probably dead family because she's not ready for them to stop is the stupidest fucking take I've ever fucking heard, Christy! First of all, it is staggeringly irresponsible to tell someone dealing with their mental illness that they haven't done enough or given enough to get better and that's why they're not, as if it's some kind of divine punishment or ordained trial and not your overcooked trauma-poisoned shit brain firing neurons in all directions desperately trying to see what sticks. Second of all, what kind of message does this send when Calia fucking dies when she tries to do this? It's her own fault she's still having nightmares? Only more suffering will make you whole? That deliberately putting yourself in harm's way is the only way to ascension? I can only assume that Golden meant to write something to the tune of, recovery can be really hard, and the road to getting there can be really rocky, but that doesn't mean it isn't worth it. You have to want to get better and be willing to put in the work in order to do it, or else nothing is going to work. And it is hard. It's about the hardest thing you'll ever do, but it's worth it. However, this is not what she fucking wrote. What she wrote was heavily coded evangelical screed about sacrificing yourself for the greater good and how your suffering is a trial put on you by the powers that be, and not, in fact, a series of indescribably complicated environmental factors coming together to form the human condition. There is no deeper meaning to suffering. It doesn't inherently make you a better person, it just hurts you and makes it harder for you to trust and be kind in a world that has hurt you and that you know could hurt you again. You can track down where it started, you can figure out the what and when and how, but sometimes the why has no answer, and searching for it will only cause you more pain. There is meaning in surviving despite it, and learning to live and heal and find a purpose beyond it, but there is no fucking meaning whatsoever in suffering by itself, because all it is pain. Taking Calia, who works so hard to live beyond her suffering, and instead tying her character to that suffering, making it so that she could not move on unless she suffered more and died because of it, is pure malice, even if it's done out of ignorance. Not only that, but the concept of a light-infused undead is inherently antithetical to literally all established rules of undeath, and clashes so strongly with the Forsaken's concept that it is mind-bogglingly stupid that they would even consider Calia to be a potential candidate for Forsaken faction leader. Oh, but I guess Anduin likes her, and we can't have a Menethil restoration without Calia, and Anduin gets to decide who owns Lordaeron, not the Forsaken, who are the same citizens of Lordaeron as they ever were, just without a heartbeat, but apparently that's what counts, and not, the fact that they were there first and are the native denizens of it. Divine right of kings for the win, I guess. More than that, there are extremely strong implications that Calia, in being resurrected in the light's image, is somehow an advanced or transcended form of undeath, and in that, unlike the Forsaken, she doesn't need to worry about inconvenient things like rotting, and the two horrifying options that come with that, being completely senseless as your body succumbs to the ravages of time, or being excruciatingly aware of every painful second of it. You see, there's this whole thing, at least in vanilla, that Forsaken are on very, very limited time in terms of how long they have until they literally fall to pieces. And one truly horrifying detail of that is that their brains, their minds, are rotting along with it. The other option is that, if a Forsaken completely loses hope or completely loses the will to keep fighting, they'll just succumb to mindlessness. Being depressed can and will literally kill them. There's a reason Sylvanas is so dead set against them meeting their families and being potentially rejected by them all over again. But oh no, we have to take that moment to make her seem like she's the Horde's evil stepmother. So there's this whole narrative that being cursed with undeath and all the terrible things that come with it are key to the Forsaken's identity and how they interact with the world, and having Calia completely skip over that kind of negates any sort of meaningful connection she could have had with them. There are certainly undead who have returned to the light or were never abandoned by it in the first place, but what makes them undead is the traumatic experience of their unholy resurrection. The Forsaken are the way that they are because they did not come back in one piece. Making it so that Calia was made undead using the light, 1, makes the light far more fallible and malevolent, and while I'd be interested in Blizzard heading in this direction, I know in my heart they're not going to. And 2, goes against all previously established rules for the light and how it works. That the core entity of your religious beliefs would decide to transform you in a way that's inherently damaging is a huge red flag, to say the least. It presents a mindset focused on anti-recovery, a sort of cult of suffering and toxicity that is not easily escaped, and will ultimately only harm you far more and far worse than anything else could. I literally cannot say this enough. There is no inherent deeper meaning in pain and suffering. That's all it is. So to say that there are good victims who were made better or kinder by their suffering, and that there are bad victims who were terrible even before their trauma and deserved it, only enforces it. That Sylvanas is constantly demonized for doing what she needed to do to ensure her survival or being angry and resentful at what happened to her is insulting and dehumanizing. Calia's fate is incomparable to Sylvanas's, starting with the fact that when Calia died, she was brought back by the hands of friends and family and immediately had a support system to fall back on. Calia is loved and accepted without question within the very first minute of her rebirth. That's not to say that Calia's trauma and experiences are invalid. Obviously, she has gone through a very real and harrowing experience, and it's undeniable that it's affected her deeply, and that's fine. However, she cannot possibly begin to understand the suffering of Sylvanas and the Forsaken, and forcing her to play the martyr in order to do so only makes her a poor imitation, destroying and invalidating her previous self in order to play good victim to Sylvanas' bad victim. She is not one of the Forsaken, and she will never be one of them. She can want to help them, she can feel guilt or regret for what happened to them, and she can even want to make herself a part of their lives, and that's fine. But she is not one of them, nor will she ever be one of them. The trauma inherent in being forcibly raised by the Scourge is probably one of, if not the largest part of the Forsaken identity, and plays very heavily into how they're coded. I've been using the word coding a lot, especially in regards to what role characters play in the story, and I think we can't really keep going unless I explain what it is here. Basically, coding a character is the act of using certain subtextual markers, intentionally or not, that make them recognizable as a specific identity or culture, even if they're not necessarily that specific thing exactly. Here's an obvious example. The Zandalari are heavily inspired from Mesoamerican cultures and imagery, as well as the general Caribbean-ish culture that they have set up for most other trolls. So it would be correct to say that they're coded to be Afro-Latinx. While coding by itself is a neutral term, its method can certainly be used and abused. It is, put simply, a very complicated matter, and it can be used to condemn certain overlooked or oppressed groups, sometimes deliberately, sometimes not. It should also be said again that coding isn't just restricted to specific cultures or ethnicities. There are a great many things that make up identity, and ultimately, identity is what sits at the core of coding. And in regards to Sylvanas the Forsaken and the undead as a whole, I think we need to talk about how exactly they're coded. So, let's take a look at the markers placed on them. The general conditions associated with the undead are as follows. A melancholic, apathetic, or volatile disposition, often a combination of all three, inability to sleep, inability to eat, partial or fragmented memories are not uncommon, as are severely limited physical abilities or senses, and chronic pain. There is often a feeling of alienation or isolation from their friends and families, former or not, and a general sense of social awkwardness or socially unacceptable behavior. The undead are uncomfortably different and excruciatingly so, especially towards the friends and family that claim that they're different from before and that they've changed too much to be accepted. They're often cast out by these families and are encouraged to take on new names to reflect their new identities. Sound familiar yet? If it doesn't, I kind of envy you and the sort of support network you must have, but if it does, then chances are you're probably familiar with what it's like to be othered. It can be for any number of reasons, but the undead in particular line right up with the mentally ill, neurodivergent, queer, and disabled. Probably some combination of them, as these conditions are a lot more common than people typically like to think. And with this in mind, it makes how the Forsaken were handled by Blizzard and how the narrative portrays them very concerning. Again, it's very natural for these people who felt so rejected and othered to lash out in response to this. And it's just as natural for them to still want love and acceptance despite this. The Forsaken are still inherently human, as are all the sentient species in Warcraft. They weren't made in a vacuum, they were made by human hands, and so they will reflect what made them. In that same vein, the different playable factions in Warcraft often become a reflection of their leader. You know, like how the Worgen in Stormheim won't stop screaming about wanting to kill Sylvanas, just like Gen. But the Forsaken, I feel, are more closely aligned with Sylvanas' desires and motivations than most other factions. In analyzing them, we can also analyze Sylvanas. Let's take a look at how the narrative operates around the Forsaken, starting with their vanilla character intro. It acts as a sort of mission statement, as all of them do, and gives the player the lens with which they are meant to experience the game as that particular faction. As a Forsaken, your faction's mission statement is to ensure your own survival in a world that, at best, pities you, and at worst, fears and despises you. This is how you start the game, with the knowledge that every living thing views you as a monster and an intruder in your own land. As a Forsaken, you are sworn to protect your own, drive out your enemies, and seek vengeance against those who have wronged you, as well as ensuring the completion of your dark plans, as the intro puts it. Presumably, Sylvanas' dark plans, i.e., the extermination of all living things. At least, this is what it was at first. Starting from the Death Now quest lines, you're immediately thrown into conflict against the Scourge mere moments after you've broken free of them, as well as the Fallen, mindless Scourge who were once your kin, and fellow Forsaken who didn't quite make it when breaking free from the yoke of the Lich King, and lost themselves to the mindlessness of undeath. So, here's the first point immediately. Survival. Not exactly dark plans, but still very, very necessary. It's a tragedy that you can't save them, but most of the quest givers you interact with, authority figures, the town clerics and guards, are practical almost to the point of ruthlessness. The Fallen are your kin, yes, but they're too far gone to be saved, and now they're a danger. You must protect those who can be saved. You have to be able to protect yourself, most of all. But the Forsaken aren't without care. One of them in particular, Novice Elrith, asks that you retrieve the remains of her deceased friend's husband, currently wandering the ruins of Tirisfal as Mindless Scourge, and bury him with her, as her final wish. It's moments like this that really humanize the Forsaken and make them sympathetic to the player. Respecting the dead, Elrith says, it's what makes them different from the Scourge. Which is really fucking funny when the questline leads you to experimenting on some living prisoners they've got in the basement. The Forsaken's narrative for vanilla mostly portrays a people so fixated on revenge that some of them are even losing themselves to it, not quite seeing the hypocrisy of their actions or even really planning for what happens afterwards, but also that, despite what they claim in joining the Horde faction, they are slowly becoming integrated into a new community and family. During vanilla, there were only a handful of Forsaken outside of their designated zones. Generally, the Forsaken outside the ruins of Lordaeron were apothecaries researching exotic toxins, with very little exception. There is, however, a larger gathering of them sequestered within Thunderbluff, inside the Pools of Vision. In Classic, there's not really much to do here, possibly because while Stormwind took months and months to plan out and sculpt, Thunderbluff took, 2 weeks? But the point is, there's really not much reason for the Forsaken to be here. One of the larger Warcraft wikis speculates that the Tauren barely tolerate the Forsaken being there and shove them here so they'd be out of sight. But there's not really anything in the game supporting this, and environmental cues seem to imply that the Spirit Rise, where the Pools of Vision are located, is where more of the spiritually minded Tauren congregate. Here is where the Shaman class trainers are seated, along with a few shops, one of them not so subtly named Spiritual Healing, but you get the point. This is, from the cues we can pick up, something of a sacred place, or at least a staging ground for the shamans and their rituals. I feel like Pools of Vision, or the Spirit Rise, wouldn't be called that if it wasn't. Blizz isn't exactly subtle in their naming conventions, or anything they do, really. So why, if they do revile the Forsaken so much, would they let them stay in the Pools of Vision? If they're such abominations, why tolerate them at all? In fact, why let them stay in arguably what is the most comfortable place for the Forsaken to stay in? It's cooler and out of sight, away from the bustling city tops and the blazing sun, and probably a hell of a lot closer in feeling to Undercity than the rest of Thunderbluff. Why would the Tauren let them anywhere near this place if they couldn't stand them that much? Why do you get Thunderbluff rep for doing quests in Silverpine? As far as I can tell, unless you're some kind of spellcaster, there's really no reason for you to be down here with the mages, priests, and warlocks that occupy the place. There's really only a handful of quests here, one of them to drop off some fungal samples with an apothecary, and another helping the Tauren with their plight and stone talon with that same apothecary. So with the first one, the quest text doesn't really go into too much detail about why Apothecary Helbrim needed the fungal spores. Just that he needs them, he's studying them, and then when he's done with them, he hands them off to you to give to his colleague in Thunderbluff. There is a specific wording I'm interested in, though, in what about them he's studying. They're from one of the unnatural oases that have cropped up around the Barrens, and they have strange, life-giving, and altering properties. Now, I'm getting a little bit into tinfoil hatting, because there's not really much to this quest beyond just dropping off the spores once Helbrim's done with them, but it feels strange that a Forsaken would be focusing on that of all things, when with most others, they're focusing on what harm certain substances can do, rather than their ability to grow and change. Stranger still is when you get there, and the rewards Apothecary Zama offers you are all potions with very helpful, life-giving properties. Yeah, they were already in storage and prepared as a reward for you, but it's a fairly obvious motif that quest rewards are generally themed after the quests they're rewards for, and it's interesting that a member of the Royal Apothecary Society would give you health and speed potions rather than poisons to equip your weapons with. Certainly the others do, when they're not giving you armor or weapons. Now this, in combination with the other questline that leads you there, wherein the Forsaken are called upon to help the Tauren, is very telling. To me, it seems that the Forsaken are there working alongside the Tauren on a cure for undeath. Again, I know it seems like a stretch, but I really don't see why else the Forsaken would be there, in the space specifically occupied by Tauren shamans, the most in tune with nature, researching life-restoring plant life, and why those same Tauren shamans would let them be there in the first place unless they were working together on this goal, and that they were on good terms in the first place. Zama seems to think so, and she's pretty openly empathetic to the Tauren and their, at the time, current hardship in Stone Talon, and even helps in solving the venture company problem, by poisoning the shit out of them. How the Forsaken express this willingness to help their allies is certain a lot weirder than their living human counterparts express it, but it's there and they're feeling it. The Forsaken, despite themselves, and perhaps despite the developers' best intentions, are integrating pretty well into the Horde, and seem to be integrating more and more with each questline. This is already going against the initial idea of them being allies of convenience, or at least growing away from it, especially in places like the Plague Lands where the Forsaken need the most help. At the end of the Araj the Summoner questline, one of the major Horde questgivers of the area, High Executor Darrington, commends you for doing a tremendous service to the Horde, not the Forsaken like he specifies in the Cauldrons questline, though even in that one he thanks you on behalf of both. It's not just areas where the Forsaken need help, however. In Desolus, the Horde is attempting to clear out the demons present in the area, as well as the Burning Blade. The player works with Jakata Steel Blade and Marin Bone Splitter, the latter being a Forsaken spellcaster who is particularly interested in dealing with the Burning Blade. He seems to have an oddly personal drive to not only destroy them, but punish them for allying with demons and betraying the Horde. So his solution is to keep their souls captive indefinitely because fuck 'em, they're causing problems for my precious baby boy. Clearly, the Forsaken are growing more attached to the Horde than they'd like to believe, and are finding a sort of acceptance from them they couldn't find from their previous friends and families, in spite of, or maybe even because of these conditions. The other Horde factions are just as othered as the Forsaken are. They understand. And this narrative follows them all throughout Classic, Burning Crusade, and up through Wrath. This is why people play Horde, I think. At least, it's why I play Horde. It's easier to identify with something that's already like you, at least a little bit, even if you don't recognize it at first. In general, the way we interact with and process media usually is sort of a reflection of something we're going through ourselves. And while the Forsaken's initial portrayal of evil, soulless, crazy people stuck on revenge wasn't handled that carefully at first, we can still understand how they got there, and there's still room for them to grow beyond that. This particular setup has enough potential for depth that it can be done well, and towards the end of Wrath that seemed to be where we were going. The Forsaken and Sylvanas, in turn, learning that revenge might be too high a cost to pursue, and having the mortifying ordeal of seeing a version of themselves that went too far in looking for revenge, and trying to find meaning in a life that up until this point has been mostly suffering. The first steps of recovery are there, and I think it's important to portray a narrative that, no matter how far gone you think you are, you can still get better. No matter how alone you feel, there is probably still someone who cares about you. Trying to rebuild your life after trauma is the hardest thing you can do, but it's worth it. And this has to be where Blizzard was going, right? Then Cataclysm happened, and all of these quest lines wherein the Forsaken were made more sympathetic just magically disappeared, or worse, were replaced with quests that really ramped up how untrustworthy they were, or how evil they were, or how insane they were. And this just takes all the narrative of learning you've gone too far and trying to pick up the pieces of your shattered life and turns it into evil, insane trauma survivors that are evil and insane because of their trauma and just don't see the irony of it all, nor do they want to. The Forsaken are bad, evil, dead people. They don't want help. They don't want to get better. They're toxic. Only now we've hit Bofa, and for some reason the decision was made to go, actually the Forsaken do like the Horde, and do learn their lesson, but Sylvanas doesn't. So now it just feels like we're just deliberately targeting a trauma survivor's main triggers and hang-ups, and making her feel even more alone and paranoid. In the Horde War campaign, there is a specific questline that affects your character's experience for the rest of the game, wherein you can either choose to turn in Zekon and Sarafang's location and become a loyalist, or lie and say they got away, marking you a rebel. Here's the thing. Sylvanas knows if you lie to her. She knows it, and she's furious. You can hear it in the way she speaks to you.
Let me see if I have this right. Sarfang single-handedly slew my elite forces and a veteran Dark Ranger. How fortunate that you escaped with little more than a bruise. Fortunate, but disappointing. Let me be perfectly clear. You will find the traitor Sarfang. You will deliver him to me, and you will not fail me again. Now go. Remember your duty to the Horde. We have a war to win.
If you played through Legion, then Sylvanas already regards you as one of her champions and affords you a lot more trust than she does many others. Even Nathanos feels a little threatened by you and how important you are to her.
Speaker of the Horde.
And this is a huge breach of her trust, which, by the way, if you weren't sure by how often she fucking says the penalty for treason is death, is kind of a big hang-up for her. Arthas betrayed the Alliance when he started killing everyone en masse. Garithos betrayed the Elves by using them as cannon fodder. Varimathras betrayed the Forsaken when he led a coup against them. Thrall betrayed the Horde by abandoning them. Garrosh betrayed the Horde with everything he did. And Zayla betrayed the Horde by siding with him. And you betrayed the Horde when you sided with Saurfang. It should be noted that, when you choose the Loyalist questline, Sylvanas' immediate response is that she never doubted you. Not once. And even in the Loyalist ending, where you meet Sylvanas back at her home, Windrunner Spire, she trusts you enough to at least lay out some of her absolutely batshit future plans, and tells you that she knows you'll understand. She knows you will. So it makes absolutely no goddamn sense for her to tell you all this and trust you, and in the same breath go, "Fuck the Forsaken," as if she didn't give a single shit about them. It should also be noted that there wasn't even an option to side with Sylvanas in the beta. Fans had to lobby for it to even have the option. From what I can tell, there are definitely plenty of people who pick this option because, yeah, this is the bad guy option and being the bad guy is cool. But there's also plenty of people that just didn't want the Horde to fall apart again. They didn't want another civil war. They didn't want to betray Sylvanas. And I think that warrants something. Like, it should at least warrant a response. There should have been some moment where the staff realized that this is really not where it should have gone. But they didn't, or they just chose to ignore it. The Loyalist questline doesn't have any real effect on the story, either. There's no real reward other than the really bizarre in-game manifesto on Sylvanas' master plan, and they confirmed in a Q&A that it's not going to have any lasting effects in Shadowlands. Like, Sylvanas isn't going to treat you any differently than if you were a rebel. There wasn't any point in giving the Loyalist option at all. Blizzard just did it because the fans wanted it, but they didn't even really understand what it was they wanted or what it was they didn't want. They probably already had this predetermined story end and then just didn't understand why people would want to stay with Sylvanas. I certainly had a strong reaction to the mock Gara between her and Saurfang the first time I saw it. I just don't understand how Blizzard could put so much work and effort into making Sylvanas care about the Forsaken and the Horde and take great pains and sacrifices to ensure their safety and survival, and then go, "Oh, you know what would be really cool? What if we made like this super Tartarus like turbo hell and we called it the Maw? Yeah, that sounds rad as shit. And what if we made up this guy who ran it? Yeah, he's the jailer. Oh, this is gonna be so fucking cool, you guys." I feel like they get so caught up in the song and dance that they forget what they're even singing about. The presentation is so important that it just eclipses everything else, and the story suffers for it. Whenever you create something, whenever you put time and effort into a story or art or something, it's very, very rare that it'll go off without a hitch. And sometimes this can be a good thing, and whatever it is you're making will turn out all the better for it. It just all depends on how willing you are to adapt and how much work you are willing to put into it. But I do think knowing your limits is a good thing too. If you push yourself too hard, there's a chance it'll end up worse than when it started, and creativity shouldn't be forced. It tends to be obvious when it is. But I think the real question here is, where do we go from here? I really do strongly believe that something could have been done with the Forsaken and Recovery. I don't really like to use the term redemption arc because Warcraft tends to rush them or badly misuse them, and I don't necessarily want the Forsaken or Sylvanas to be good. I just want them to become a healthier version of themselves that they're okay with. That's kind of the point of Recovery. Let's talk about the Battle of Undercity again. You know, when it was first put in game, at the end when you, Sylvanas, Thrall, and Saurfang, who has a name now, holy shit, are just sitting around moping trying to figure out what the fuck we're gonna do now, it was really up in the air what was going to happen. It was the first questline that I did that really had any gravity to it. I started playing in BC technically, but by the time Wrath came around, I had only barely hit 58, and I had rushed my normally snail's pace leveling so that I could make a Death Knight at launch. I was scared of what could happen, but also really excited. Wrath was a really exciting time. So much was going on in the story, and everything had this real weight to it, like everything we did had a real effort and consequence to it. Varimathras' coup had this really daunting seriousness to it, and it was the first time I had really experienced something of that nature in a game. Thrall and Sylvanas were, and are, despite everything, characters that I really love and care about, and it was really inspiring to 16-year-old me who had just finished Warcraft 3 and was playing their very first MMO to play alongside them. I've tried other MMOs, but none of them really stuck like WoW did. I'm not going to say that there wasn't love and effort put into other MMOs, because obviously there is in every creative endeavor, but it wasn't apparent in every facet of it like it is in WoW. This game is made with so much love and excitement, and it's hard to say there will be anything else like it again. I mean, there's a reason it's lasted 15 fucking years despite everything. And for the record, I am excited for Shadowlands. I'm really excited for Shadowlands. It's this whole new frontier of new things and people and places that WoW's never really covered before. Not really. And while it's taken them way fucking longer than it's really should have to do it, Blizzard is finally making massive improvements to the character creator, making it far more accessible than it's ever been, and giving players far more and better opportunities to see themselves in a thing that's important to them. I think it's a valuable thing that we show these different perspectives on Azeroth, and want to really make clear that, there's people who sometimes say, well, Warcraft is this medieval fantasy game, and those kinds of things weren't talked about in medieval times, so they shouldn't be in Azeroth. But I disagree with that. I think that Azeroth is a world of magic and a world of possibilities, and one of the things that's really important to know is that in Azeroth, you can love who you want, you can identify yourself the way that you want, and all of those things are possibilities. We just want the game to be able to reflect that through its storylines and through its character customization options, and we're really excited about that. I think, looking forward, our best case scenario for Sylvanas would probably look something like this. So, Sylvanas is inspired from Kerrigan, right? Well, sort of. In an interview with Chris Metzen, it was revealed that at one point, Jaina was supposed to have Sylvanas' story, where she was killed and raised into undeath, but they opted out of doing it because it was too much like Kerrigan's story in StarCraft and made Sylvanas instead. And I don't know if they had realized it at that point, but guys, it was already way too late for that. When they first put out StarCraft 2, the ending was really controversial. A lot of fans really hated it. But personally, having never played StarCraft, but having heard many an enthusiastic tangent about it, I really love the idea of this woman survivor being able to go back and wreak havoc on the people who hurt her. It's not really something you see in media ever, unless said woman is getting punished for it, but guys get to do it all the fucking time. I think it's really cool that Kerrigan was able to seize her revenge with her own hands and be rewarded for it. Yeah, she might have lost her long-term partner along the way, but they ended up getting back together later, and he supported her in doing this. And while having a supportive, understanding partner is really great and not something that's seen that often in revenge stories like this, she really just did this for herself and no one else. And that's really revolutionary. As far as Sylvanas goes, I'm still sticking with what I said before. Sylvanas' emotional core is pride and love. I think it was really cool that she got to destroy the Lich King's helmet, but ultimately this wasn't the particular tool of her destruction. I still think it would have been more appropriate for her to actually take part in the Icecrown raid beyond the dungeon encounters, but we are well past that now. I've actually talked a lot about this with my editor, who's a close friend of mine, and we were tossing around the idea that Sylvanas might be playing the long con with the jailer. Personally, I think it would be really cool if she was actually acting the role of double agent, working for the jailer for right now, but ultimately waiting to gain enough power from him to turn on him and destroy him, and the Maw, freeing everyone who's been trapped within it now and for all eternity. I think that someone like Sylvanas could justify to herself what could ultimately be the suffering of the few for the salvation of the countless, and that their suffering, no matter how horrible it was, would only be temporary. After all, freedom has always been one of her big goals, hasn't it? Or she's gonna be a tier 1 raid boss and we're gonna knock her out like we did Illidan's stupid ass at the beginning of BC. It's not really our call here, and personally, I like Blizzard, but I'm not really confident in them either way. Realistically, they probably will do something incredibly fucking stupid that none of us could have predicted. Like Warlords of Draenor.